Hi everyone, welcome to our second webinar for Customer Centricity Month 2023, Building Customer-Centric Teams. It's really wonderful to have so many of you signed up for today, and I can see that our numbers are going up already, which is great. So before I hand over to today's speakers, Riz, Neil and Sarah, and while people are still joining, I just want to say hi and introduce exactly what Customer Centricity Month is. So I'm Lauren, I work in the marketing and events team at CX Partners. And at CX Partners, we work with organizations to drive growth, unlock opportunities, and enable teams to work together more effectively. We do this through research programs, user-centered design, and by embedding a culture of customer centricity within organizations. So last year, we started Customer Centricity Month as a way of creating dedicated content that's all about the value of user-centered design and putting customers at the heart of your organization. So this year, we're running the series again, but focusing on how customer centricity can make organizations more resilient and enable them to thrive when external conditions can make it challenging. This focus came from some research we conducted this year into how turbulent environments may affect organizations and their ability to remain customer-centric. We've recently published a white paper with our findings from this study, so I'll send a link to where you can download it from at the end of the session. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second webinar of the month. Last week, we spoke about staying competitive in challenging times, but we'll be running another 3 sessions, all at 11 a.m. every Wednesday throughout November. So if you haven't already, make sure the rest of them are in your diary, and I'll pop a link in the chat in a moment. But now I'm going to hand over to today's speakers. So leading today's session, we have Rizwana Hussain, who's our Principal Service Designer, and Neil Schwarz, who's our Experience Strategy Director. We're also joined by our brilliant guest speaker, Sarah Blewett, who's the Head of Research at Carwow. As Head of Research, she leads their research globally, and she works with the product marketing and commercial teams to use customer insights to improve Carwow's products and services. So there'll be time at the end for questions, but please do add them to the Q&A or the chat throughout the webinar if there's anything that kind of pops into your mind, and we'll run through as many as possible at the end. Riz, I'll hand over to you now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lauren. We're really excited to be here today. And one of the reasons we wanted to host this talk from CX Partners is that we really are focused on helping organizations become more customer centric. And by that, we mean how centered around the customer the organization actually is. We've done research in the past, and we know that customer centric teams actually deliver results and deliver them quicker. From our research, we've seen that actually 69% of customer centric organizations are able to adapt by making major changes to their systems within weeks rather than months and years, which transformation can usually take a very long time. Organizations that actually scored really highly on our maturity model gave 9 times greater year-on-year growth compared to those scoring lower. And actually, we found that 90% of customer-centric businesses had high levels of employee satisfaction. So that's a win-win in our eyes. And today, what we're going to talk to you about is about building customer-centric teams. We're going to talk about methods that we've used in the past. We've tried and tested both from experience working in-house and also working as CX Partners, a consultancy. So this is our customer centricity, can't get my words out today, maturity model. It focuses on 5 dimensions, so people, process, communication, facilities, and governance. It was produced underpinned by the principles of lean, agile, and user-centered design. And we found that these 5 dimensions are really important when it comes to building a team and an organization that is customer-centric. And to me, customer-centric always sounds like a weird word. It feels like it's made up. And then when you bring it down to a team, what does it actually mean? When we say customer-centric team, we're talking about a group of people working really hard to understand their customers, their needs, their motivations, and what they actually really value. You might see people interacting with customers regularly, speaking to them, having deep conversations with them to actually understand those underlying needs, and actually needs that you might not even know exist at the moment. And they often act as an advocate for the customer and champion the customer in an organization. And the reason this is really important, because at the moment, to stay competitive, businesses really need to understand what parts of the experience the customer actually values, and not just the product that they receive at the end. If you have people in that organization that can ask the right questions and understand what problems you actually need to solve, you'll address the right things rather than fixing things that don't actually really matter. And then you can put all your energy and effort into building that trust with your customers and creating that emotional connection that can often last over years and even a lifetime. But it can sound like a mammoth task. It can sound really big, and it's really hard to know where to start. But I would say start small, start really simple, start with one team. That's often what we do here at CX Partners. So establish a team that can really advocate for your customers and have that voice in the organization and bring that customer voice into the boardroom. Someone that can show the tangible impact of bringing customer insight. And when we talk about insight, we're talking about more qualitative insight rather than data and analytics. It's that rich conversation, that deep understanding, that deep connection that you have with people and bringing it into the business and influencing the wider organization. And today, what we want to do is pass on our learnings of how to establish a customer-centric team. And we're going to do this in 3 parts. So first, Neil's going to start with laying the foundations and getting started. And then I'll speak to you about growing your team and your skills. Over to you, Neil.
Great, thanks, Riz. So yeah, so I'm going to start by talking about the foundations you need to have in place in order to build a customer-centric team. So change is difficult, particularly if it rocks the status quo. So you'll need to have solid foundations to keep you on track. So I'm planning to share some of the things I've learned whilst working with organisations like Nationwide Building Society, SSE Energy, and Google. And so when I was thinking about this session, 4 things jumped out at me. So first of all, people. So Riz mentioned our customer centricity maturity model, and people is one of the 5 dimensions and arguably one of the most important. So when we talk about people, we mean the skills you need to deliver a great customer experience. And of course, having skillful people isn't all it takes. You need the right organizational structure and culture as well. But that comes later. We're just talking about the foundations now. And so when I think about people and skills, as a practitioner, I immediately think of the disciplines you'll need, the hard skills. So you'll need people that can do user research and that can do product design. I really like this simple encapsulation. It was shared with me by my colleague Tom, an experienced director here at CX. So across the top, you've got the 4 different steps that you might see in any sort of typical project life cycle. And what this shows is just shows the blend of skills between research and design that you might need across that project. So to varying degrees throughout. And what powerful pairing user research and product design are. Of course, you could also consider like a UX generalist, someone who can straddle the whole spectrum. I think people who do this well are few and far between, and you could argue actually that you really want to create a separation between research and design. But just to go a little bit deeper, I really like these bullets here. So Jared Spall wrote a foundational article about the indispensable skills for UX mastery. And I actually have this front of mind when I'm recruiting people to join our team here at CX Partners. So sketching to quickly convey ideas, storytelling to share what you've seen in research or to present your rationale, critiquing to help make ideas even better, and presenting to share work across the organisation at all levels. And then finally, facilitation to bring the best out of others and foster collaboration. So I feel like these are sort of really great traits of any really strong user-centered designer. But what about this? So I'm sure you'll have all seen and heard these sorts of things before, well, we already know our customers, or we shouldn't ask our customers what they want, or we don't have time or budget to do research. We just simply don't trust these small samples that you keep talking about. Well, beyond the discipline skills and then some of the kind of the hard skills that we were just talking about, you're going to need people that are resilient, pragmatic, but above all are advocates for user-centered design and can persuade people in your organization that this is the right way to go. So I'm just going to share a quick example. So in terms of building a team, of course, you can hire people into your organization, or you can use an agency or consultancy like CX Partners to help. And obviously, we're a big fan of that. So Nationwide is the largest building society in the world. They're the second largest provider of household savings and mortgages in the UK. And they faced a problem. So other people, by which I mean freelancers and agencies, were developing their user experience, and all that expensive knowledge was repeatedly walking out of the door. They had their own internal UX team, but they were in pockets, and they were seen more as a delivery resource rather than a strategic asset. So we worked with Nationwide to set up their own in-house central design agency called The Studio. You could say that we laid the foundations there by creating this model office. And we started by bringing together the designers from across the organization. And we built on that team with our own researchers, designers, delivery managers. So initially there were 28 employees at the studio, 15 of which were from CX partners. So over the course of the next 12 months, we helped Nationwide to recruit and backfill those positions. So at the end of the program, they could operate the design studio completely independently. And it worked really well. So it's one way to get skills into the organization is to do something similar to this. So when we talk about the customer-centric team, it needs to extend beyond design. So you'll need allies from across the organization. So in engineering, marketing, product, operations. And if you're in a regulated market, of course, you're thinking about compliance and risk. Not everyone's going to be on board, and that's okay. And really, you want influencers. The more senior, the better. So I read this article just a couple of weeks ago. It's by Maya Alvarado. So she's a senior accessibility researcher at Booking.com. And in this article, she talks about how Booking created their accessibility research practice. And I just really love this expression. She talks about having formed a task force of people with a shared mutual interest in the topic. And that was the first thing that she did at Booking.com in order to start building out that practice, sharing ideas, inviting lunchtime speakers, and just formed a community. And I just think it's a really great way to look at it. This is a model. It's called the diffusion of innovation theory. It was developed by somebody called E.M. Rogers. It was in the 60s. And in its simplest form, there are people that are going to be up for change and then will embrace it. And then people perhaps that don't, we will call them laggards. So my advice would be to go where the energy is when you're laying down the foundations. So you want to go to where the like-minded people are within your organizations. These are the ones on the left. You want to then build momentum, prove that it works. And then those to the right of the chart will inevitably follow. So the third point in laying the foundations is around process. So this is going to be how your team are going to work. So it's not just useful for your team, but for the wider business who are going to be drawing on your team's expertise. And it's going to enable you to push back if the organization is wanting you to work in a way that doesn't fit with this user-centered design methodology. One of the biggest shifts for an organization that's new to user-centered design is to move away from the habit of just starting with a solution already in mind. So whilst working with SSE Energy, we need to really help them to make that shift. And this model really came in handy. And of course, we borrowed it. I'm sure you'll have seen it before from the government digital services. I love this model. It starts with a problem rather than a solution. It's simple. It's easy to adopt and easy to understand. It's really adaptable to most situations. And because it's agile, it reduces risk and uncertainty, and that makes it easy for people to buy into it. And of course, it's commonly used. So there's lots of good advice out there, and people are familiar with it. So we used this for our first project. We showed that it worked. We then formalized this approach. And now all subsequent value streams, when they get set up, adopt this approach. Final thing I want to touch on in terms of laying the foundations is just around purpose. So as well as having the right team with the right skills and the right levels of influence and processes, you really want to be able to bring that team together to coalesce around a common purpose, to form a unifying mission that's underpinned by some stated goals, your strategy. So if you joined us at the webinar last week with Max McShane, who's the head of digital at Octopus, you'll have heard him talking about their mission at Octopus Energy. So they were the most customer-centric organization in our recent study, but not only did they do well in our research, but that's translated into some pretty impressive results as well. So their growth over the last 7 years has been exceptional. And the customer advocacy is the envy of most brands, probably all brands, to be fair. And Max explained what it is that they do that generates such success. He says it comes down to this kind of singularity of mission. It's really clear what their priorities are. When they're making decisions, big or small, their priorities are based on these 2 KPIs. And this is not just in the design team, this is across the entire organization, all departments. The question is, will this initiative improve customer growth and customer love? Customer growth is pretty easy to understand. That's, about growing their customer base, but customer love is probably a little bit less straightforward. And this is how this is how they define it at Octopus. So, so this is, is this initiative going to prompt a response like this? No other supplier would do this for me. What I like about this is it's a really clear stated mission. And whilst, this is a company-wide mission, it's something that, I'd recommend putting in place for your team at the foundations. Ideally, something that also ladders up to your company strategy and goals. Okay, so that's the laying of the foundations. What I'm going to do is just cover 3 tips for getting started, and then I'm going to hand back to Riz. Okay, so the first thing in terms of getting started is to really consider your first project as a pilot, a Pathfinder project. So it's an opportunity to test and learn and prove the value. So I think it's really critical to get this right. If you pick the wrong project, it can be really painful. If you pick something that kind of runs too much across the grain of the company, it stands a chance of failing. And if you're trying to demonstrate the power of this new way of working, you really don't want that. So what makes a good pilot? Well, you need to be able to move at pace. You need to be able to showcase the methodology, and you need to demonstrate value. Again, here's an example from Nationwide. So we picked a project, and the goal was to build a product that would enable branch staff to have valuable conversations with customers. So what was it that made this such a great pilot? Well, it was self-contained, so we were free from politics and legacy tech, and it meant that we could move quickly. The stakes weren't so high that risk aversion was kicking in, and there were no politics involved. We could quickly and easily do user research by popping to the local branch in Bristol. We could bring together a cross-functional team, including risk and compliance. And it was small enough that we could make progress extremely quickly. But what was really most important was it actually gave us the perfect case study. It gave us something that we could demonstrate and take to the rest of the business and show that what we were doing worked. And it wasn't an accident that we picked this project. We carefully thought, well, what is the right way of getting started? Whilst you're running your pilot, you need to work in the open. So you want people from across the organization to see what you're doing and to get involved. Of course, there are loads of opportunities to work in the open when you're doing user-centered design. You can involve people in shaping the problem to solve, involve people in shaping the research, the types of users that you're going to speak to, or the questions you're going to ask. You can run ideation sessions, co-design, and there's plenty of opportunities to do playbacks. I like this photo. I think it's a bit of an old one, but I really like it because it perfectly encapsulates the spirit of what I'm talking about. It was taken whilst we were working with JISC in their offices. We set up this war room. Walls were plastered in our work, and we just wanted people to get involved and see what we were up doing and see what we were up to and contribute. We can't really do this so much now, actually. Wall spaces tend not to have so many pictures on them as people are working increasingly in remote environments. But there are other ways, of course, to shout about what you're doing. So two examples of that. The first one, doing things like lunch and learns, doing show and tells, just really shouting about what you're up to. We're running a series of lunch and learns for the Civil Aviation Authority at the moment, and it's proving a really useful way of, just talking about what it is that we're doing. And the other one is just using using technologies like Yammer. So we were working with this huge FTSE 100 earlier this year. helping them to embed user research culture. And so every time we did any user research, we were shouting about it, inviting people to come and join in via Yammer. And that's the most useful way to get people involved, the most value really. It's an absolute game changer to get people to come along and watch your research. So in fact, we built an entire program around this whole premise for Google. So since 2019, we've been running these things called mobile labs. And the whole premise is that you can harness the power of watching user research because it inspires action. So in each day-long lab, we work with one of Google's top advertisers, large digital commerce brands typically. We've run about 200 of them in the last 4 years. And the whole idea of each lab is to inspire the brand to take action by getting them to watch real customers struggling to use their mobile products. So we spend the morning watching user research and then the afternoon coming up with ideas. So it's really simple. And why is it so successful? Well, we hear often that one of the biggest blockers to implementing improvements is organizational misalignment. So what these mobile labs do that's so powerful is that they bring together a cross-functional team, and always there's senior stakeholders present. And then just watching user research is an absolutely eye-opening experience. And then having the senior people involved unlocks doors. So we hear people talking about things like this, having had an eye-opening experience, or actually this is the first time that we've come together in a team in this way. So the final thing in the section around getting started is just around celebrating successes. So, shout loudly. So you want to show that you'll be able to make a measurable difference. In order to do this, you've got to be really intentional about it right from the start. So you need to have clear objectives for the piece of work. You need to be able to define exactly how you're going to measure success and make sure that you capture the information in a measurement framework. Doing so is going to then obviously build appetite for doing more work in this way. So you want to take your results on a roadshow, create show reels, get in front of your exco, but just really shout loudly about what you've achieved. Okay, so that's getting started. Riz, I'm going to hand it back to you to take over from me and talk about growing.
Thanks, Neil. And I just want to reiterate Neil's point around celebrating success. It's like sometimes it takes a lot of time to build that impact, and you do want to shout about it. And people do want to hear it, and they actually get really excited about it. I've seen it in organizations that I've worked with, and it's worked really well. But now on to growing. So you're at the point, you've laid your foundations, you've got some tangible evidence that customer-centric teams actually deliver value. Maybe you've got more than one project under your belt and you want to keep growing. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 things that you can focus on. So the first is your team, so kind of expanding your team and your remit. The second is scope. So actually that's more about the remit, what you're working on, being able to ladder up to work more strategically. And lastly, it's about spreading and growing culture in an organization and shifting mindsets. So if we start thinking about your team, the first point to start is actually getting your house in order. So setting up all those basic structures that will help you scale, because as your team grows and even as this capability grows in different areas, you want everyone to be working in the same way, using the same methodology and not competing ones. You want that consistency. You don't want to create things from scratch. And also you want to make sure that customers experience your company as one organization and not make it feel like it's disjointed bits of different parts of organizations and experiences. And one way to do this is to create systems and structures around your work. So codifying your ways of working, your processes, your practices. There's a few different ways you can do this. Like we often help our clients build these out when we're building that capability. You could create something like a CX playbook that captures all your processes, methodologies. You could also have a design system which has all the components and structures around your digital assets. Or you could have a pattern library which excuse me, speeds up those processes to create digital content, which means that you can actually focus on more strategic stuff and help the structural stuff almost run independently. And next, it's also about spreading that capability. So it's not just the resource, it's actually sharing your skills. You might blend your team out to different areas of the business, and it's about working with them, not just doing the work, but actually sharing your knowledge, the capability, so that they begin to hopefully adopt those practices as well. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is scope. This is probably one of the most important things, more than the others. It's being able to go beyond those small scale improvements, those little interaction things that you might be twinkling with, and working more on the end-to-end kind of strategic journey level. And this requires a lot of work, and it requires influencing at all levels of the organization. So you kind of want to be able to extend your influence, and often you'll be starting from the bottom up. You might be working with different teams, different departments. And we also acknowledge that you need that influence at the top. So you need it at the exec level, the C-suite. Sometimes people say getting the voice of the customer in the boardroom, and that's kind of what you need to advocate for and try to do. And that will really help you be able to move in a more customer-centric direction and be more customer-focused. And most importantly, don't forget the middle. You can be working from top down, bottom up, but there is a layer in the middle, and these are your partners. These are the people that you want to be working with. When I was working in-house at a retailer, I was working in the customer experience strategy team, and what we started to do was actually build relationships with functions that were parallel to us, that would often work directly in the same spaces that we did with customers. So that's like departments like brand, marketing, product teams. And we started to establish a really good relationship and actually started to collaborate more. So we are working together on those interactions and on those early parts of a customer experience to build that consistency and not have conflicting messages as well. And in doing that, you can start to go beyond the scope of what the business thinks your team is there to do and start to influence things more strategically. One of the challenges that I've found a lot working with organizations is that the business has this understanding of what your team can and can't do, and they often don't give you the permission to do more. So it's like Neil said, it's about shouting about your skills, being able to share your perspective, that strategic thinking, and actually show that it brings value, and slowly starting to move up that ladder and thinking more strategically and end to end. And lastly, to enable all of this, you need the right culture in an organization. And that's usually like the slowest to change, sometimes the most hardest to change, but it doesn't mean that you don't try. You might not see progress immediately, but you will get there. And it's things like Neil mentioned earlier. So working in the open, being visible, like people seeing what you're doing. Neil mentioned a war room. We would often have like journey maps hung up on the wall. So when people walk past, they kind of take a look and they get intrigued, and that kind of brings them into the experience and the process as well. And with that, I think one of the biggest things is having a service design mindset. And I would say it's not just a discipline or a role, it's an approach to looking at things more strategically, looking at the bigger picture, so zooming out, and then trying to figure out where the bigger opportunities are, and then zooming back in and narrowing down on them into a specific part of a service or an experience. And it really helps people to shift their mindset from thinking more tactically to strategically, starting to join the dots in different parts of interactions that they might be having. And it kind of brings more context to scenarios as well. An example of this is, like I mentioned, when I was working in-house, I was working as part of a service design and CX strategy team. And what we found that working with the tools, processes, that mindset, it would start to trickle out. So we saw designers using the same methods initially across digital customer journeys, but then starting to look across touch points. So not just their own channels, but others channels that exist and where customers interact through multiple channels. And then we saw colleagues starting to use mapping techniques that might not necessarily have done it initially. And those mapping techniques like journey mapping really help them get into that customer mindset by breaking things down really into small steps. It helps you orientate and try to understand that customer and bring it to life a lot more. And then lastly, we saw colleagues starting to become responsible for creating their own services and touch points as well. So you can see that it can have that ripple effect and start to go from the center out. And that's kind of what you're hoping to get. And it's slow and steady growth, not a hare, more like a tortoise, kind of like growing steadily. So you sustain that change over time. And now I'm going to pass back to Neil to kind of give us a bit of a summary of what we've spoken about.
Yeah, thanks, Riz. Yeah, let's just quickly recap on those things. We talked about the foundations, how it's important to get people with the right hard and soft skills. how it's important to build a community that extends beyond your immediate team, define how you'll work by defining your process, and then you set your mission, be really clear about what it is you're trying to achieve. In terms of getting started, start with a pilot, prove it works, work in the open so others can see what you're doing and participate and join in, and then finally to celebrate your wins. And then growing, so putting the tools and practices in place to enable you to grow your team, growing your scope, so working on more strategic end-to-end problems, and then finally influencing the wider organizational culture. Okay, so we've just been sharing our perspectives, but we've got a brilliant guest speaker, Sarah from Carwow. And I know that, so Riz and I have been itching to ask Sarah lots of questions. And there will be an opportunity for people who are watching to get involved too. So please feel free to post your questions as well. So Sarah, can I just hand over, maybe if you could just quickly sort of say hi and introduce yourself, and then I think Riz is going to probably fire some questions your way. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen.
Sure, thank you. Hello, I am Sarah. I'm the head of research at Carwow. We are a business across 3 markets. We're an automotive marketplace that helps people buy and sell their cars. And my role at Carwow is to help everyone across our business better understand our customers. It's not just a UX role sitting within the design product team. It's really a broad role working all the way across the business, whether that's facilitating our execs actually speaking to real customers, right down to user testing of new things we're working on. And I have a lot of experience setting up a research function from scratch. I'm also happy to answer any questions about that.
Brilliant. And thank you so much for giving us your time today, Sarah. I know we've spoken briefly in the past, and we are really interested in what you've been doing at Carwow, how things have progressed. But to get us started, can you just tell us a little bit about what it was like when you first joined Carwow? What was the customer experience like? What was their maturity like? How was that impacting the business?
Yeah, so we didn't have a user research function. I was the first user researcher. User research was done within design, within product, which is really important to be doing user research there, but there was no one across the business thinking about how we make sure that our customer experiences are joined up and consistent, and that we are really starting from customers when we're starting to solve problems and thinking about what problems we wanted to solve.
And how was that impacting the business? So it was more intrinsic focused, that kind of internal, we know how to do things. That sounds a bit rude, but it's like we are going with what we know rather than giving up that almost control and saying, actually, we trust other people more than we trust ourselves. Like, that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, I think the impact was that we just didn't understand the broader context of our customers. We didn't understand how our products and services fit into their lives, how they were compared to competitors, what we could solve for people that no one else was solving, and just a real broad understanding of how our products were currently landing with people as well. So we had a lot of data from customer support. I find customer support to be a really useful research data pool, but we didn't understand the sort of real outer circle, the real outer ring of people's contexts when they're thinking about changing cars.
So how did you start to bring that thinking, the outer context thinking, into the organization? Obviously, being the first person joining, setting up a function isn't easy. And it's like, how do you, like we talked about growing team, how did you do it there?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is to speak to your stakeholders and understand their understanding of research, their desire for research, any real concerns they have, and try and allow people to be really honest with you. Do you think this is going to be a waste of time, and why? And what would credible research look like for you? What do you need to see to make it believable? How actionable does it need to be? When does it need to land with you? All of those sorts of things to sort of prevent any problems from happening in the first place.
Yeah. Was there anything specific that kind of sprung out when you were talking to like different stakeholders in the business? Were there like anything that was like surprised you in terms of what they care about?
I think one thing that stuck out, and it was actually in one of your slides, is that people think research is going to be expensive and it's going to slow you down. People think that user testing can be useless because we can user test things ourselves. We don't need people to tell us things like that. And I think there sometimes organizations do maybe too much user research, and you can get these ideas that we're testing everything and that's not necessary. And sure, that might be true. And user research can be expensive, but it absolutely doesn't have to be. And I think a good user research function, or a good way of being customer centric, it's fitting in the research you can around what the business needs. So there are obviously always going to be commercial requirements and things that we need to think about commercially, but there's always a way to fit research in to make sure you're really understanding customers. And I think also sometimes there's this idea that research comes at the end, and I think good research has to come at the beginning. So one thing that's really important to me in my role is constantly sharing things with execs about our customers, so that when they're thinking about what products and services they want to start bringing in, they're thinking about it from a customer first perspective. And that's doing things like being in exec meetings, being in meetings of different sort of products around the organization, and making sure that you're constantly surfacing points about our customers that they might not realize, things that they're confused about, things that are really important to them, things that are important contexts for their lives.
Yeah, that's so important. Like the point you mentioned around bringing research earlier into the process when you're starting to think about new services, new propositions, because I've found that too. It's often like research almost ends up being a tick box exercise. Okay, we need to test this function with 5 people, usability test. And it's like, actually, by logic, you probably don't need to test some of that stuff. You've done it before, you're repeating the same thing, and the actual value would be further upstream, like earlier in the process. And I guess, like, how did you get people to take that seriously? Like, that's the question, because I've found myself in that situation, and it's really hard in big organizations to get someone to listen.
Yeah, I think by sharing interesting, relevant tidbits in sort of an interesting format. So I like to share videos, really short 30-second clips, and I'll say on Slack or some other company channel, if you want to understand, if you have 5 minutes to understand customers, watch this. And I spend a lot of time making sure I'm sharing things that are really interesting and really going to capture people's attention, so that when they are then doing their day-to-day lives, they will think, oh, we have this way of speaking to customers. Let me go find out if we can do that for my role, for my problem, for what I'm doing. And sometimes that's stitching things together into a 5-minute summary video for a specific product we have, or sharing a newsletter, a really short, interesting newsletter, 5 things to learn about customers this week. So just making things that are going to be interesting for people that they can't help but watch, or that feel really easy to watch as part of their day-to-day lives. One thing I've noticed, which is so simple, is that if I share things in the body of an email, people will read it. If I share an email and link to a PowerPoint, just that one extra click to open a PowerPoint means half the people aren't going to do it. And so just making it fit into people's lives is as easy as possible.
Yeah, and that's like based on research and service design, isn't it? It's like adopting the same methodology to the audience that you're speaking to and trying to cater towards. I love that. And by the sounds of it, then it feels like outward communication is really important. So being really proactive with it, speaking, like creating content, sharing it, kind of getting your foot in the door, trying to be like constantly communicating rather than waiting for people to come to you. Is that, would you say that's kind of like more of your role, is actually really not pushing, but trying to get that word out?
Yeah, pushing, absolutely. And trying to be approachable. I think that's huge in user research. There's also sometimes people feel like user research can be very academic and dry and use a lot of jargon. And so I try and eliminate as much jargon as possible from when I'm sharing things with people. When I'm speaking to designers and product managers, that's where the jargon is absolutely fine. But when you're speaking to people across the business, it just alienates people, I find.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like, one of the things I've personally found as well is that common language really helps. So use simple words that everyone understands, that they mean the same to everyone else as they do to you, and it cuts through a lot of the noise and the confusion and gets to the point a lot quicker. So I love that. Have you got any advice that you'd give to someone if they were in the same position and wanted to grow, I guess, a research team, but also like a customer-centric kind of point of view in an organization?
I guess it depends how much of a risk you're willing to take. If you don't have a lot of, you're not able to take a lot of risk right now, the single easiest thing you can do is figure out a way to speak to customers. But go to your CRM team and see if you can email 500 people and ask them to speak to you, and just set up 10 calls in your diary to try and speak to customers and ask them questions. You can get something like Hotjar, a really low code, inexpensive survey tool on your site. You can put something in the bottom of your customer service email saying, click here to schedule a time to give us your feedback. Anything you can do to just start talking to customers and start understanding them is huge. It'll make such a difference. And then you can start sharing those insights out and start building that appetite within the business. I think if you have a little bit more resource, just as you said, start hiring people to do this, bring in an agency to help you do it, just depending on where you are on that spectrum. But if you can do nothing else, figure out a way to speak to your customers.
Yeah, that is really good advice, because like there's so much insight in customers. By listening to a few conversations, you gain so much more than looking at, I don't know, Google Analytics or whichever platform you use as well. You touched then on some of the hiring, like hiring a team. What would you say are some of the skills that are really important when you're looking to hire someone into your team?
We are a scale up, so we value things that maybe would be different to a huge organization. But where in my role, in my team, I look for people who I think are going to be really proactive, who are really comfortable talking to customers. Obviously, that's a big one, but are going to be really proactive and go out and find customers to speak to and ask them questions and really listen to their answers and be really curious about what's driving their decision making. Why are you doing that? Why did you consider that competitor? And then why did you ultimately not go on to use them? I think all the skills that Neil mentioned in his Jared Spool slide were really useful. And for me, it's not super important to have a ton of experience in user research. It's more about having the right attitude and the right behaviors. Yeah. Now, if you're at a huge organization and you're trying to get user research started, or user-centered design started, you might need to bring people in actually who are able to speak the language of the organization, and have the research skills and have more of a sort of refined background. But I think for me personally, the most important things are get people who are willing to come in and really get curious about customers and what's driving their behaviors.
Yeah, I like that. So someone who's a bit like, might be a bit rogue, not vigilant, but kind of go off, do their own thing. As long as you've got like all the structures in place, so you making sure they're signing consent forms, doing everything in the processes, but actually just being willing to put themselves out there, be seeking people, because that's often one of the hardest things, is actually trying to find customers to speak to as well. Have you ever had challenges with that, like recruiting? Or
we constantly sort of refine our recruitment methods. Sometimes we get more people than other times. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky. We have like we have quite a lot of traffic to the site, and we're able to recruit people from the site quite easily. And because we are quite broad in that our audience is just people who are changing cars, that's a lot of people across the UK. So we also don't tend to have problems with recruiting via agencies. I would say some easy ways to recruit are, if you have an existing flows, try and recruit people that way. So if you're already speaking to people in CRM, can you get a little something at the bottom of your CRM, as long as your legal team approves this? Can you get something at the bottom of your customer support emails? Can you if you already have a survey tool, can you add onto a survey tool to try and recruit people? There's a lot of sort of scrappier ways that you can get people that don't need to be a sort of 2-week-long process of building recruitment.
Yeah, and that kind of talks to the point you mentioned around people saying it's too expensive, it's too slow, it kind of takes too long. So it's kind of having that in place, so when you need it, you've got people that you can reach out to and get that ball rolling a lot quicker.
Yeah.
What are your plans next then for growing your team? I know when I spoke to you earlier this year, you were a team of 1, and now more.
Yes, 2.5. We have 2 people in the UK, a contractor in our Spanish office. In our German office, and we'll hopefully get someone in our Spanish office as well. And then hopefully 1 more role early next year. So growing, yeah.
Yeah. And how did you get that permission to grow your team? Because it's not often easy to be like, I need to hire someone. You're going to have to fork out, I don't know, like money to pay for consistently. Yeah,
there's just more and more research requests, more and more people in different teams across the business wanting to understand their customers, whether for our commercial teams, their customers are car dealers or people in car dealerships who are buying cars. And then people in the marketing team wanting to understand more and more about the people they're speaking to that we're trying to bring on site. So I think we've just had a huge amount of requests for research, and the natural answer to that is, I don't have any more hours in the day. We're going to need to hire more people. Yeah. It shows how successful you've been at kind of building that relationship with the kind of leadership team, the execs, and actually advocating for that customer voice and sharing the insight like so openly, so regularly. And that kind of shows that the impact that it is having. Yeah, I think once you start understanding the benefits of building things based on what customers really want. It's hard to go back.
Yeah. Has there been any failures along the way? Like, have you had things that didn't go quite right, things that you've learned something from, and it's actually been good to fail in a way?
Yeah, I'm increasingly convinced about the limitations of user testing. So that's quite it's very, very technical answer. But I think when you're speaking to people about their context and their lives and things like that, people are willing to be quite honest and open, and they know how to answer the questions. With user testing, we have done user testing sometimes where the results just do not align with what we're finding in A/B tests. And so we've had to go back and think, what is going on here? And I think I'm just finding that the benefits of user testing are fantastic for things like finding bugs, finding things that are confusing, finding things that are unclear, but sort of testing two prototypes against each other, things like that, people just don't know. And it's one of the real basics of user research that I've messed up a little bit sometimes in my eagerness to help people and give people answers, is that people don't know what they would do in a hypothetical situation. And so sometimes when you're asking them these sort of hypothetical, what would you do next? They just don't know. And so there's just real limitations there of research of things that are not real yet.
Yeah.
Alongside many others, but that's a sort of recent one.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I've kind of had similar experiences in the same way, where you ask people what they would do, or you compare two things, and it's actually like they don't really care.
Yeah,
they have nothing to compare to. They're not in that moment of doing that thing, that it's actually not as relevant to them as it is to you. So that's really interesting to hear that you've had similar experiences. I've got one last question before we open it up to the audience, and that's, so Neil talked a bit about Octopus and how they measure things, so what metrics they use. What metrics do you use at Carwow? Like, what do you focus on when you're thinking about customer experience and that? What do you measure?
We have a whole host of measurements, just standard funnel measurements, things around customer experience. We also do CSAT. I much prefer CSAT compared to NPS. And then we measure sort of the ROI of user research by thinking about projects we've done and what the direct ROI of those have been, and also looking at sort of maybe more qualitative metrics, like how many people are asking us for research repeatedly. Is that a good way of measuring that we're doing a good job? How many times do we help maybe the execs get the appetite amongst our customers for a new product they're considering or a new revenue stream, and say, actually, that's not a good idea. No one wants that, so let's not do that. Or, yes, let's do that, but you need to probably frame it in a different way because the way you're currently speaking about it doesn't resonate. So how often are we able to sort of help steer business decisions in a way that's really customer friendly? We are very metric happy business. We got all sorts of stuff going on for metrics.
I love that. I love the fact that you think about yourself as a service and being able to measure and track the impact that you're having through the amount of contact that you're getting from people. I guess that the demand is growing, and being able to show that and the value of it. Super interesting. Thank you, Sarah. That's been really interesting to hear, like, all your insight, sharing all that knowledge. And I think especially around the challenges, how to get started, like just starting small, speak to your customers. I think often if you can't speak to customers, speak to your colleagues, like frontline staff. They'll be the next best thing as well. So that was really riveting. Thank you. I'm sure we will have you on again. Maybe when things have progressed a bit more, we can do a bit of an update. Sure. Brilliant.
Yeah, well, I just want to say also, thank you all so much, Riz, Neil, and Sarah. That was brilliant. And yeah, as we've all kind of mentioned earlier, if anyone does have any questions, please add them to the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen now, if you haven't already. And I guess we can jump straight into it. So the first one that we've had, I'm not sure who wants to take this. I might pass to you, Neil, to start, and then Riz, Sarah, feel free to add anything in. But they're just asking if we could reiterate some of the key ways to influence senior decision makers to change ways of working.
Ways to influence senior stakeholders in terms of changing. So I think, it's about trying to find things that actually the senior stakeholders care about. And, there's various ways you can go about doing that. Of course, you can gather all kinds of different bits of data. Obviously, the data is great at telling you what's going on, how a user is behaving. It doesn't really help you to explain why they're behaving in that way. So actually that starts to pose quite a fundamental and important question that people can then start to really care about. And there's various different places you can go for that. Obviously you've got your analytics, but I think Sarah touched on it a minute ago, really, actually spending time with frontline staff to really understand what are people getting in touch with, what are the problems that real people we know that are having a problem with, and therefore what are the problems that we don't know about, that people aren't prepared to phone up about. What are the things that are making a difference to our metrics? I think that's probably the sorts of things I think about. I don't know if anyone else on the panel would add anything to that.
I think I would add, depending on which context you're in, if you're in a really corporate environment where money matters, like speak that language. Sometimes people want to know the physical impact, whether you're reducing costs or you're going to increase sales conversion. That's what some people care about. I think others, like Sarah said, it's like getting them closer to the customer, whether it's those vox pops, audio clips, certain things, and the things that are really emotive as well. So getting the people to connect on a human to human level, taking away all the business stuff, everything else, connecting as humans. And then my third thing is that I tend to be a bit cheeky, use humor, make it a bit lighthearted and make it harder for someone to say no. Form relationships, kind of have a good relationship with those people that they know they can come to you and ask for support when they need it. And you have that kind of two-way reciprocal relationship. I don't know, Sarah, if you have more to add on that.
No, I think that's great.
Okay, perfect. Then the next one we've got is, do you have any suggested timescales for moving through the stages? So from sort of foundation to growing. I'm not sure if anyone kind of wants to take this one.
Gosh, I think it probably depends, doesn't it? I think laying the foundations. Well, that need not take a huge amount of time. I guess it depends on the size of the team that we're talking about as well. So going back to the nationwide example, obviously, we were dealing with setting up a studio of nearly 30 people. So laying the foundations was a kind of a fairly monumental task in itself. Just making sure we got everything in place. But if you're able to just get started, with a specific engagement, then it could be done in quite a lean way, I think. And in terms of going from getting started, again, I think you need to prove yourself with one project, and then that will then unlock the opportunity to scale. So again, I think probably I might go to Sarah. So I bet you've probably got something to say on this. I don't know.
No, I think the time scale just completely depends on the size of the organization and how small of a project you're going to start with. I think if you can start with a small project, something that's really just going to take a week or two, you can really start to prove the value of it, as you said. And no, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, nice. So if we move on to the next question we've got, it's any suggestions for recruiting competitor users for research? It's quite easy for us to get our loyal customers to talk to us, but it's harder to recruit from competitors. Oh, go on, Sarah.
Yes, we do this. I think everyone likes to do this. One thing is if you use an agency, certainly maybe not the cheapest way, but a way. Or if you have any kind of survey tool, ask people what competitors they're using and then route the question that if they choose the right competitors, you say, would you like a £50 Amazon voucher or whatever sort of incentive you use? You probably need to incentivize for this. Would you like X benefit for speaking? Would really like to improve. You don't have to frame it as we want to know if you're using a competitor, and that means we want to talk to you. But in the course of collecting the information about people, you can route what you're doing to make sure that the right people see the recruiter, which is trying to get people to speak to you. There's a chance I've misunderstood the question, but that's how we tend to do it. And you can also, if you want to recruit people who have used you and a competitor, that's a great way of doing it. And then you can do contextual inquiry, which is a sort of user testing where you watch them use your site and a competitor site and ask them to think aloud as they're doing it, talk about while they're doing it. It's a really, really great way to gather really rich insights.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know, Riz or Neil, if you had anything you wanted to add, or we can just move on to the next one.
No, I think that covers it really nicely.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we've got another one here that says, you mentioned the importance of training others in UX skills as part of the growing process. So I'm assuming, Riz, this one will be for you. Or I suppose to anyone actually. Do you think some skills are more transferable than others? We've found it hard to get other departments on board with doing their own research.
Yeah, I can start in a bit. Sarah can jump in as well. I do think research is one of those skills that is very unique, specific, takes a lot of practice, and it does need training, whereas some other things you can pick up as you go along. But with research, there's so much nuance to it in terms of using open-ended questions, not closed-ended questions, not leading people, not implying things. So you really do have to spend the time and energy. It's not saying you can't learn it. I only started doing it about 7-8 years ago, kind of thing. You can learn it, but it is an art form. It takes practice, and it's about coaching people along the way, I think. So even if you can't be with other departments all the time, or if they don't want to do it, maybe it's bringing them along to some sessions, getting them intrigued, seeing the value of it, and then getting them to run a session alongside you where you may be doing it half and half, and slowly building that, not just a capability. I think sometimes it's confidence. And the other thing is, like, you don't want to get results that aren't accurate as well. So you don't want to put words into people's mouths. So it's about, it takes time. I think Sarah can probably speak to it more after working at Carwow. Have you had that experience?
Yeah, I think exactly what you said. And there's different parts of the research process. And so you can work with them to come up with a research plan and the approach. You can do that quickly, depending on what the project is. If you're doing something like customer calls or user testing, you might want to do that yourself as the researcher. But then what you can do is hand over the assets and say, okay, here's the information. You go analyze this yourself if time is a problem for you. And so there's different ways you can share the research process. And I guess it would also be worth trying to understand what is stopping the other departments. Are they scared about speaking to customers? Is there a way we can sort of do some practice sessions? Do they feel that they just don't have time, which is probably what a lot of people say, in which case, you can do it for them and then hand things over so that it's as easy for them as possible. And there's a lot of talk about democratizing research, and I think it's fantastic. But as Riz said, it's a skill. And so especially someone who's not independent, it's very easy to get led into hearing what you want to hear, confirmation bias, which is why researchers are helpful, because we're meant to be independent in the process.
Yeah, brill. So we've got a couple of minutes left, but I think we've probably got time to run through one last question and then we can wrap up. So I think there's one here for you, Sarah, which I know you've touched on earlier. But what are some of the most important lessons that you've learned along the way?
In terms of, if we're thinking about building a customer-centric business, which is I think what this is all about, we want to make it as easy as possible. I've already said this twice, I'm gonna say it again. Make it as easy as possible for people to understand your customers. Make it interesting and fun so that when they see something from you, they want to open it and they want to hear what you have to say. Make it short and do it regularly. Be sharing with people insights about your customers, asking open-ended questions, and sort of get the business interested in what the answers might be. So I would really like to learn X. Does anyone here use our product that can help me answer that question? That sort of thing. Other lessons, I don't know. I think so much of the things we've learned are just someone mentioning a question in some meeting somewhere, and then just running with that and trying to find the answer. So being really curious about your customers and being really proactive in understanding them.
Brill, thank you. So yeah, we're at time, but as I mentioned earlier, we've published a white paper with our findings from our recent study. So I'll just send the link in the chat to that, and there should be a QR code coming up on the screen shortly, I think. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for today's session, Riz, Neil and Sarah. It has been so interesting, and there's been some really great insights in there. And also a huge thank you to everyone for coming along. It's been really lovely to have you all here. Yeah, we'd also love to hear your feedback. So please do get in touch with any of that. And yeah, I hope to see you at next week's talk too. So yeah, thank you everyone. I hope you have a lovely afternoon.